That was fun. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Riverbend. Whether you're here in person or you're online and laying in your bed or on your couch or in your car or chasing your children around, we're glad you're here. We're glad you're tuned in. Let's ask God to come hang out with us. God, we ask that you fill this room. That you make us aware that you're here. Make this moment more than music. I want you to think about wherever you are, what it is that you are looking for today. Part of this path, this journey is us, at least for me, is just sort of learning how to let go of the things I don't need and replace them with the fulfilling things. The things that I was created to be or to receive. To ask God for that today. Come bring your freedom. Come bring forgiveness. Come bring your peace. Be my redemption. Come bring your freedom. Come bring forgiveness. Come bring your peace. You are my redemption. You are my chain loser. Found for me the secret of connecting with God is just sort of being open to it. And it's weird when you're standing around a bunch of people and you don't want to look like a fool. I get it. I even have that feeling here when I'm sitting playing with you guys. But there's this guy that wrote the Psalms in the Bible named David, and one of the things about him is that he was just kind of abandoned to this pursuit of experiencing God as a friend, as a connecting being in his life. And so I think we all have that opportunity if we're willing. There's no right or wrong way. The only thing I can offer is just to breathe and be open to feeling the presence of God, because it's a very, very real thing. God is a very, very real thing. You're in my living, you're in my breathing, you're in my waking, you're in my sleeping, you're in my resting, you're in my working, you're in my thinking, you're in my speaking. Be my everything, be my everything, be my everything. Be my everything, be my everything, be my everything. You're in my hoping, you're in my dreaming, you're in my watching, you're in my waiting, you're in my laughing, they're in my weeping, you're in my hurting, you're in my healing. To be my everything, be my everything, be my everything. Be my everything, be my everything, be my everything. Be my everything. Be my everything. Christ in me, Christ in me, Christ in me, the hope of glory. Be my everything. Christ in me, Christ in me, Christ in me, the hope of glory. Be my everything. Be my everything. Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh, God, how I need you. Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. You're my one defense, my righteousness. Oh, God, how I need you. When I feel helpless, when I'm losing control, when I'm scared of what will happen, if I do or if I don't. When it's dark, when I can't see it there, when it's hard for me to let go, but you be my everything, 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 nothing to lose, be my everything, nothing to lose, be my everything, nothing to lose. Nothing to lose. You're a good, good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are. And I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. You're a good, good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are. And I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. When we heard 1,000 stories of what they think you're like, and we've heard a tender whisper of love in the dead of night, and you tell me that you're pleased and that I'm never alone. 'Cause you're a good, good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are, and I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. I've seen many searching for answers far and wide, but I know we're all searching for answers. Only you provide, 'cause you always know what we need before we say a word. You're a good, good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are. who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. You're a good, good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are. And I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways to us. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways to us. You're a good, good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are. And I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. Amen. You may be seated.
Thank you, Casey. We all give them a round of applause again. That was awesome. We are so grateful to have you here this morning. For those of you who are joining us online or who are here in the building. But for those of you who are here, I don't know if you can feel that energy of corporate worship and being together again. It's my favorite time of the week. I imagine you feel the same way. We would encourage you, if you're at home, to come join us. There is nothing like being here together. To celebrate that and to celebrate summer, we are introducing food. I don't know if you were here last week and you got one of the donuts, but we had donuts earlier this morning, and we've actually got not one, but 2 food trucks after the service. There's one out on the plaza, and there's another one over in front of the Student Center. We would love to have you stop by and get some food and hang out and just fellowship. We're going to do that again next week. So if you're at home today, but you don't want to miss out on that opportunity, show up next week. We're going to have another couple of food trucks. We have a ton going on this summer at Riverbend. We're really excited about our events. This week is actually Vacation Bible School. My kids are really excited about that. That'll run the 8th through the 11th, and then on Friday, there will be this big in-person party that's going to be super fun. The kids are also going to have a glow-in-the-dark party in July. We've got a whole water splash day happening in August. If you've enjoyed the music with Carlton, we've got a hymn sing coming up June 30th in the chapel. That'll be an incredible opportunity to be in person and gather together to worship. We, as always, can't do any of these things without your generosity, so we are continuously grateful for your support. If you're here in the building and you want to give, we've got these black boxes in the mezzanine and up at the doors, but if you're at home or online, you can also do that on our website, through our app, or you can text 84321. Would you join me in prayer? Father, thank you for being here. Just like Casey was talking about the psalmist David abandoning himself to the pursuit of you. We've carved out time this morning. We're here. Would you nourish us, Lord, with your grace? We thank you for all that you're doing here at Riverbend and beyond. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Good morning. I have a simple question for you. Why are you here? It's a simple question, but it might not be that simple. You've got a variety of answers. I talked to a guy between the services who said, I'm here because I had a drug problem when I was a kid, and I kind of got serious, and he said, my mom drugged me to church. And so we went every day, and it became my habit, and I keep coming back. And so maybe some of you have been dragged to church. Others of you may have the other kind of a drug problem, and you're finding a haven here. Some of you come because, as Stephanie, it's your favorite time in the week. There are all kinds of reasons to come, but the level at which I want to ask the question why you're here goes back a little further from this morning to the things that ever led you to believe that this might be a good place to come, that belief in God, that following the way of Jesus, that being with a bunch of people who talk about those kinds of things might actually help your life. So it's really the question, why do you believe, or at least why do you want to believe? And it turns out that Dave Haney has spent the last 3 weeks, I think masterfully, walking us through that question. The series, My Apology, has been a walk through sort of the anatomy of belief and why we might continue to believe these things that were claimed and lived a couple of thousand years ago. And he put them in categories. He first asked, is there a God? And what basis could we have for believing in a God? And then he went to why would we believe the Bible? And then to why would we believe that Jesus actually rose from the dead? But if you were listening, you know that it wasn't just sort of, okay, how can we believe in God? And here are 37 reasons. How can we believe in Bible? Here are 25 reasons. It wasn't wooden and sort of the usual sort of amassing of evidence. He walked us through sort of the logic of belief. It was brilliant and even sort of, as he put it, beyond the logic of belief. And in order to do all that, of course, he took us to Acts 17 and he walked us all up a big rock in the middle of the ancient city of Athens called the Areopagus. Do you remember this? Each of those 3 Sundays, Dave took us to Paul standing on the Areopagus, the Apostle Paul standing on the Areopagus. And this is sort of the epicenter of ancient intellectual life. People gathered there, and if Athens was the center of ancient intellectual life, this was the epicenter because people gathered there to sort of unpack the great mysteries of philosophy and the great questions of life. And Paul, when he went to Athens, got kind of invited into one of those conversations with the Stoics, who kind of ruled the philosophical world at the time, and the Epicureans, who weren't far behind. He was in heady company, and Dave walked us through his brilliant speech to the Athenians from that rock. Right? So we've been taken beautifully through the anatomy of belief, why we would believe, how could we sustain belief in these days. It turns out that I listened with more interest than just at that level because I got to be on that rock 10 years ago, on that Areopagus. I got to stand up there in my cargo shorts and my dirty golf hat and read out Acts 17 to my 30-person study group. We were from a church in the Twin Cities area of Minnesota, and we had been walking the footsteps of Paul from Philippi over to Thessalonica and down through to Athens, and we had come to the great city and made our way to the great Mars Hill, the Areopagus. And as I say, there were 30 of us, but I got up there and started reading Acts 17 and talking about it, and it started to sound sort of bigger than the chapter. And all these people, you may have seen on the earlier photo, all these people kind of come there because it's a tourist attraction, and they started to gravitate to our group. I'm just talking in my cargo shorts and my hat, and all these people start. Pretty soon there are 100, 150 people listening to Acts 17. It was kind of a brilliant moment. I'm sure it was just my brilliant rhetoric that drew them. But I doubt that. I think it was more the cargo shorts and the hat. Because they, as Dave told us in that passage, it says the Athenians are always looking for something new, and it turns out that tourists are the same. This wacky reverend guy in strange clothing is up talking on the rock. We may as well tune in for a second, right? But that moment was big for me, and I remember going home that night to the hotel and wondering for a second, because we've been talking for 3 weeks about Paul and the Areopagus, wondering, how did Paul get there? What things in Paul's life led him to the place where he would be speaking on this amazing stage in Athens, the intellectual center of the universe? And in order to get at that question, you kind of have to go back to a point of huge transition in Paul's life. Paul's conversion may be the most famous in the history of the world. We have paintings of it. He was a rabbi. He was a rabbi. In fact, he was one of those disgusting people who broke the curve in every class he studied in, right? He rose. He's the kind of guy who either would have graduated high school. We're in graduation season, right? Either would have graduated high school at age 12 because the school couldn't hold him, or he was always in the library. But however he did it, he exceeded his peers by a margin at every level. He became kind of that Harvard, Oxford scholar of Moses' law and was a big deal, right? He studied under Gamaliel, who was a central figure in rabbinic Judaism, and Paul was a big deal. So he was a committed Pharisee, student of the law. But then something happened, and it happened while we're watching in the book of Acts. Something happened that radicalized Paul. Suddenly he went from a library student of Torah to an enforcer. He started to persecute this offshoot movement called Christians. All of them are Jews, mind you, but this offshoot movement called Christians got under his skin, and he started to become an official persecutor of this new movement. In chapter 7, he stands by in the book of Acts as Stephen, the first martyr in Christianity, is being stoned by this rabid mob. Stephen has been up talking in public, and this mob comes by and just starts stoning him. So Paul is said to, in that passage, be kind of the human coat rack. Everybody threw their coats at Paul's feet as they went over to stone Stephen, right? And two things could happen, I imagine, if you watch somebody die for their ideas or die in a public place like that for speaking. One is you could be mortified, horrified, and you could turn the other way and just walk away from that whole enterprise, right, of the persecution. Or the other, and this is the one Paul chose, you could double down, right? Paul chose to double down. escalated. So in chapter 8, it says he's dragging men and women, Christians, out of houses and exposing their Christianity and exposing them to persecution. He was a primary menace to the church. This is his career. And so coming into chapter 9, where we hear the story of his conversion for the first time, Paul is feared by the Christians wherever anybody hears about him. And he decides to go beyond Jerusalem and start going out into the hinterlands. So he goes to the chief priests and he gets the papers that will allow him to go and do what he does in Damascus, north of them in Syria. So it's a long trip, and I imagine that along the way, he is ticking off names. He's probably got a mole in Damascus. He's ticking off names, households that he surely needs to hit and drag the people out there. He's kind of working through his itinerary. But as he nears Damascus, the Bible tells us that he's walking along, and suddenly a bright light comes from the heavens, comes from the clouds. And there's a voice, a booming voice that goes along with it that says, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Right, and this bright light has literally knocked Paul off his feet. His name is Saul. He's knocked him off his feet. And he's lying there a little dazed, and he looks up and he says, "Sir, who are you?" The Greek word can be either sir or Lord, but something's coming from this guy, and it's bigger than him, so he says, "Who are you, Lord?" And the voice that comes back says something very interesting. It says, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Now that's got to be confusing. Paul's dazed by having been knocked off his feet, but he's got enough brain cells left to wonder, wait a second, I've been persecuting people in the streets. You're in the clouds. What did I ever do to you? Right? But this voice has come and said, you're actually persecuting me. Yeah. And so in that aftermath, the voice of Jesus says, but get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you need to do. The famous conversion scene of Paul. And so the question we're asking is, if I asked you, why are you here this morning? What has led to you believing that this kind of place might be a good place to probe around for the most important things in life? If we ask that of Paul, the most obvious answer would be, well, Jesus did knock him off his feet, right? How many of you have had a knock you off your feet moment with God, right? You have been walking along a road, and all of a sudden a great light and a great voice come from heaven, and you're on the floor. Raise them on up, right? A couple of you have, right? There are life interruptions like that, and God bless them. And it may be that we look at that and we say, well, obviously Paul became a Christian because Jesus took the extra energy to knock him down. But I wonder about that, because I've heard of people who have had visions and they last a little while, but then they start to doubt them and stuff. So why is Paul so eager to continue in this faith that knocked him off his feet? Is kind of the question I want to ask. What is it, beyond the experience, what is it that kept Paul in the faith, right? And I have a feeling that on that ride into town, his buddies, because he's blinded, his buddies have to help him go into town. And on that ride into town, into Damascus, where he will stay at the home of a guy named Judas who lives on Straight Street. And on the way in, he's got to be kind of recounting. See, when Stephen was killed, when the stoning of Stephen happened, he was preaching, he was speaking out loud what he believed. These guys start throwing rocks at him, and the last thing he says before he dies is, God, don't hold this against these people. Now, if you've hung around like the Easter season at all, if you've run around Bible at all, you know that sounds a lot like Jesus saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Here's Stephen looking a lot like Jesus, looking courageous and loving in the face of menacing opposition. And Paul's sitting by watching it. Right? Then he goes and drags these people out of their houses. every step along the way, he's seen courageous Christians who don't back down simply because there are people out there who don't like what they're doing. Every step along the way, he's seen these Christians who come up with virtue in the face of great pressure, right? And then he gets into town, and I want to notice together that what God doesn't do, what Jesus doesn't do, is set up a meeting for Paul with somebody who can sort of teach him or debate him into believing. Paul is a heady, brainy guy. We've already been through that. But you might expect that therefore Jesus would say, go into town, there'll be this guy who can tell you all about Christianity, tell you the whole thing, persuade you to be a part of us. That's not where he goes. In fact, at the same time as Paul is coming into town, God is giving a vision to a guy named Ananias who is just your average, everyday Christian. Right? And the vision comes and says, okay, Ananias, I want you to go over to that house of Judas on Straight Street because there's going to be a guy named Paul there, and I need you to go and escort him back and get him started with the Christian community. Right? Well, let's see. If you're Ananias and you have heard that this menacing persecutor of the church is in town even, but if you've heard that God is sending you over to pick him up, what do you say? This is like the hen being told to go out and escort the fox back in, right? Or this is like the nerd being told to invite a bully to the study session. This is danger presenting itself. God says, Ananias, go over to this guy who's beating up Christians and bring him into the fold. So Ananias says, well, I've heard these things, God. But in the end, he goes and he picks up Paul and he walks him into the community, and the rest is kind of history. It's months, it's years before he's on the Areopagus. But notice, Paul isn't given over to somebody who's going to talk him into faith. He's given over to somebody who's going to live him into faith. Because Ananias has to be courageous to go over and pick Paul up, right? Ananias is no shrinking violet. Ananias loves God and loves Paul enough to risk coming over. Paul's introduction to the faith is not an intellectual one. Paul's introduction to the faith is a lived Christian life of courage and love. Right? Isn't that interesting? So the things that Dave has been ushering us through for these 3 weeks are important because it matters what you believe. It matters how you think about God. It matters that the obstacles to faith get addressed, right? We need that. But it's my experience in the world that without a lived life to back it up, it doesn't really end up sticking. Let me illustrate. A lot of people are leaving churches or not joining churches right now in the United States. Do you know the statistics? Have you seen them in the news? They've been kind of trumpeted about. In the month of May, we learned that for the first time in American history, fewer than 50% of Americans belong to some kind of Christian community. Right? We're members of some Christian congregation. It went under 50%. And here's the problem with that. For the years between 1940 and the year 2000, it had been pretty steadily hovering around 70%. So from the early part, just before the United States gets into World War II, all the way up to the year 2000, we've got Christianity at about 70% of the nation being members, right? From the year 2000 to now, that has dropped more than 20%. And so the question, if I ask you, why are you here this morning? The question is, why aren't they here this morning? And when they're asked to answer those kinds of things, the people who are asked, how do you perceive Christianity? Generally answer something like, well, it's pretty judgmental. It's pretty hypocritical. Those Christians are often hypocrites. We see them on TV saying one thing and doing another thing later. And then the third that's recently come in is those Christians are extremists. Because the face of Christianity in the world, on the news, on the broadcast, the face of Christianity is judgmental. And because it can't back itself up, is hypocritical. And is, in many cases, extremist. Friends, people are leaving and not coming to church because of things like that. Because we don't look so good. And their question is, how can a loving God give birth to people who do that kind of stuff? How can the people of God be so far from the character of God? He's a good father. It's who he is, right? But we don't look like that. At least to the world, as they look at us, we don't look like that. So it's hard to persuade them with our words when our lives don't seem to them to match. In fact, we've got a little bit of a crisis because a third of Gen Z and nearly a third, 31% of the millennial generation don't belong to any churches. That's the least church two-generation span in the history of taking the stat, right? By a margin. Young people are looking and saying, Christianity is not something I want to sign on for. Not because they can't believe in God, but because they look around at God's people and say, I don't want a piece of that. Isn't that tragic? Isn't that tragic? So how do you answer that? Paul said in Romans chapter 2, as he looked at the sort of Jewish communities of his time and saw hypocrisy in those, because Christianity was just barely a child, when he looked at the Christian communities, or the Jewish communities, he said, you in Romans 2, he said, you who swear by the law, do you keep the law? As it is written, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. You hear that? God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. What's Paul saying? He's saying God's reputation is at stake in the way you all are behaving. And so the question becomes, how do we answer that critique? Dave has taken us for 3 weeks through how we answer intellectual critiques, how we answer the sort of anatomy of belief questions. But how do we answer this one? You guys don't look like your God, and I don't want a piece of a God who looks like you, right? Well, it turns out that in history, when Christianity has thrived and people have flocked to it, it's been because those people have been moved by lives that were better than their own, lives that were courageous, living in loving community. Throughout the history of Christianity, there have been people from the outside who have been skeptical, who would not be won over by argument, whose hearts were melted by the way the Christians loved one another and loved them. It's an Ananias thing. It's a Stephen thing. In the 2nd century, late 2nd, early 3rd century, so about 200, there was a guy named Tertullian. Tertullian was a hard, skeptical lawyer. And he looked at the Christians and he spoke of them with disdain, and he engaged them in intellectual conversation, and he didn't think they could hold their smoke in that arena. And so he had largely rejected Christianity, but then he came into contact with actual Christians, and it turned him around. They didn't argue their way into Tertullian's life. They lived their way into his life, and here's what he wrote in a sort of thinly veiled autobiographical reflection. He says, "It is mainly the deeds of love so noble that lead many to put a brand on us. See, they say, how they love one another. For the critics themselves are animated by mutual hatred. How they are even ready to die for one another. For the critics themselves will sooner be put to death." So in the middle of this is simply the statement of Tertullian that turned his mind. The skeptic became a believer, not because of argument, because he looked at Christian lives. He said, see how they love one another, how they would even die for one another. Courageous love lived out in community transformed Tertullian, and he went on to do great things for the church. It was about 50 years later, in the second half of the 200s, that there was another sort of hardened skeptic he was a rich guy who made his living persuading people. He was a fabulous orator, and he was famous for it and much in demand. And he ran into some Christians, and he couldn't be bothered, frankly, with their arguments. They couldn't keep up with him in the intellectual sphere. But he kept running into them, and he kept seeing who they were. He had a friend named Donatus, who was a fellow skeptic. They used to kind of cast aspersions on Christianity and criticize the Christians and say how stupid they were and all these things. But in time, he was worn down by the Christian love. And so here's a letter to Donatus in which he reports something for the first time to his fellow skeptic. It's a bad world, Donatus, an incredibly bad world, but I have discovered in the midst of it a quiet and good people who have learned the secret of life. They have found a joy and wisdom which is 1,000 times better than any of the pleasures of our sinful life. They are despised and persecuted, but they care not. They are masters of their souls. They've overcome the world. These people, Donatus, are Christians, and I am one of them. Argument couldn't do it. Lived lives of courageous love did. Right? So how do we answer this critique that comes from the Barna polls and the Pew Center polls and the Gallup polls that people believe Christians are hypocritical and judgmental and extremist? How do we answer that? History tells us, and Paul's life tells us, that the way we answer it is with lives that are lived in courageous love with one another. In other words, it matters at least as much, and probably more, that we just be church in a needy world. That we be loving, Christian, courageous community in a needy world. That seems to be what melts the skeptic's heart. And I think Paul knew that when he spoke in Athens even. There he is up on the rock. I mean, it must have been a heady day for Paul. I mean, he's from Tarsus. He's done his work in Jerusalem. Here he is in Athens talking to the Epicureans and the Stoics and kind of living in this intellectual universe. He had to be just thrilled by it. But just recently, just before he got to Athens, he had been in Thessalonica. In Thessalonica, he went into town and did his usual. He set up shop and built his tents and invited some people in, and pretty soon there was a fledgling group of Christians there, and he was starting to build them and put some leaders in place and all of that stuff that he usually did. But then persecution came. His life was in danger, so they kind of ushered him out of the city secretly and got him on. He went to Athens after that. In fact, scholars think that our letter that we call 1 Thessalonians, Paul wrote from Athens back up to the northern church of Thessalonica, right? So he's up there, he's on Mars Hill all the time knowing that the words he's speaking aren't going to do the whole job. He makes some converts. Dionysius the Areopagite, says Acts 17, used to hang around the Areopagus, and he loved what Paul said, so he joined the group, and others joined the group too. But what Paul knew, even as he spoke, was that what changes lives is integrity lived in community. And so in this passage from 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, in this passage, Paul writes to the Christians there, from whom he's been ripped away too early. He says, just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. The lived life, even Paul, the heady Harvard, Oxford guy, even Paul realized that when it comes down to it, the lived life is the transformative thing. The reason I know this is that it happened to me. Because I was a little sixth grade skeptic when a young sixth grader moved to my town in the 2,004-person village of Sheridan, Oregon. His name was Joseph Hoover. I don't know, has the slide already gone up? He was the only black person in this 2004 person town. And we became fast friends pretty quickly, partly because we played sports together, partly because we lived near one another. But talk about courage. I heard the N-word so many times directed at my friend, and I saw him when he was in company that didn't think that he should be in this town, and he answered it with grace. I saw him live courageously the life of an extreme minority in our little town. And more than that, I saw him love over and over again, not only the people who were treating him badly, but he loved me. Right? He loved me. I had questions. I was a 6th grade skeptic, and so I wanted to know, is there really a devil or not? He arranged an appointment for himself and me to go and talk to his pastor, and I don't even remember how we resolved it. I just remember that Joe wanted to help me walk forward, and there we were talking heady topics in a pastor's office. And then I remember him being there when things were going wrong for me, and being there when things were great for me, and living courageously the faith that other people despised. Joe Hoover is why I was on that rock, the Areopagus, and Joe Hoover is why I'm here this morning. He embodied the Christ. He brought Jesus into my life, not just with words, but with a life. And it changed everything for me. I bet many of you could access an experience like that in your own life. Friends, if we're going to talk about a loving God, we have to be a loving people. We have to stop fighting one another. We have to stop marginalizing one another. We have to stop being judgment, hypocrisy, and extremism. We have to figure out how to be courageous love lived in community. And I've got a little PS on that group that followed me up the rock 10 years ago. They had a little reunion last week. They're in Minnesota, I'm in Austin, but I'm on Zoom with this whole room full of people who are still together because they started courageous community and they've kept loving one another all along. The answer in their life was the answer in my life, which was the answer in Paul's life, which is the answer in Tertullian's life, which is the answer in Cyprian's life, which is probably the answer in your life. God shows up where Christians love one another in courageous community. Amen? Amen.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saves a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no last days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. I have this hope as an anchor for my soul through every storm. I will hold to you within this love. All my fears swept away. trust in you. There is hope in the promise of the cross, 'cause you give everything to save the world you love. And this hope is the anchor for my soul. My God, you stand unshakable, unshakable. What a challenge, right? To love in a way that sort of wipes away the judgmental history that so many have left. Just so much of our brokenness is left. God, make it so. Give us that window, that door to love like no other, to love like you. You guys go with God, go in peace. We'll see y'all next Sunday. cross. You give everything to save the world you love. And this hope is the anchor for my soul. God, you stand unshakable. Guys, have a great Sunday.